Hey there, my name's Charles, and in this Networking 101 video, we're going to create and configure a virtual network and discuss IP addresses for subnets and the address space for that virtual network. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Azure. All right, the first thing we're going to focus on is creating and configuring a virtual network and subnets within a virtual network. So it doesn't really matter if you're migrating virtual machines, you're creating virtual machines. If you need to use private endpoints later, like networking is going to be kind of that central thing that you have to create that has to be out there and exist in your subscription, or you're not going to be able to communicate with things. So in the Azure portal here, we're already signed in. I'm going to go over to virtual networks on the left-hand menu. We could also use the search bar up top to look for whatever resource type we're going to look for. And we're going to start to look at what we need to create a virtual network. So if we click create here in the portal, every resource has to live within a resource group. I already have a resource group created here called Twitch Demos. We're going to select that to put our network in place, and we have to give it a name. Now there's plenty of guidance in the Cloud Adoption Framework and the Well-Architected Framework around naming conventions. Obviously, different organizations are going to have different naming conventions. Generally, you want to be able to identify the type of resource that it is, maybe the location or the region that the resource is living in, the purpose of the resource, and then maybe some numbering, whether it's randomly generated or whether the number has a purpose. Sometimes this is hard depending on the type of resources. Storage accounts, key vaults, other things have DNS requirements, so we can't necessarily use special characters. Maybe there's character limits, and so you might have different naming conventions for different types of resources. So in this case, to create a virtual network and to kind of keep that naming convention idea in mind, we'll name it VNet. I am going to keep it in East US region, so we'll add EUS as an abbreviation for the VNet. And then we'll just call it demo, but this maybe could be a hub, a spoke, an application-specific thing, and then 001. So that'll be the name of our network. This is what, anytime we're running reporting, we're going to go back to manage this virtual network. This is what the name will show up as. Then we'll go over to the IP addresses tab, or we could click next to do that as well. And so every virtual network has an IPv4 address space. Now it's given me one address space here by default. This is based on what I currently have in my subscription. This is maybe the next one that is available. But an address space is going to be the big, broader bucket of addresses that are available for this virtual network. Now this is different than the subnets. The subnets are going to be individual address spaces within the virtual network. But if we were defining, and if you want to kind of translate this to on-premises things, this is what the flat network would be in terms of the address space that's available for that data center or for that region, or in this case, maybe for an application. So all of the subnets that we later define have to be part of the original address space that we configure here in the virtual network. Now we can absolutely come back later, add more address spaces, change this around a little bit. That can be a little cumbersome depending on then how, maybe if it is a hub and spoke model, if you've got VPNs that get created, if you have overlapping addresses between now this Azure region and maybe on premises or another cloud. There's a lot of planning that needs to go into planning and consideration that needs to go into place to determine what you're going to use here for an address space. You'll see the default is a /16 on the address space that gives you 65,000-ish addresses. It'll tell you there in the portal. We can absolutely change this. If we wanted to change this to just a /24, we don't need that big of a network. Perfectly fine. Now we've only got the 256 addresses in the entire address space. Notice it removed my subnet because now I changed it, but we can further break this down into smaller subnets if we needed to. For the purpose of the demo, I will put it back to a /16. And we'll go back to the 65,000 addresses. So now as I add subnets, all of my subnets have to fall within this 10.2 network. So if I add a subnet here, we can just call it subnet 0. And maybe the first range that I put in will be 10.2.0.0/24. Now notice here, when I put /24 in this in the address space, it told us that we had 256 addresses available, because that's the entire range of a /24 network. When we do it at the subnet level, the math here still comes out to that 256 addresses, but now we have 5 Azure reserved addresses. So of course, in just general networking, Azure or not, the first address, meaning .0 in this case, is reserved as the network identifier. And the very last address, .255 in this case, is reserved for the, oh, and you can't see because of my camera. Move the camera out of the way. So we've got subnet 0 here and the 10.2.0.0/24. So .0 is the network identifier. .255 is the broadcast, the broadcast IP address. And so where are the other 3 IP addresses going? Well, .1, .2, and .3 are reserved for Azure services. It's virtual IP addresses behind the scenes that make the network work. You can think of it as the router, the internal DNS server, a virtual IP address on top of those 2 things. So it's the behind the scenes services that make the virtual network kind of work and do what it needs to do. And so that means the first available IP address in this address range would be 10.2.0.4. So .0 is the network identifier. 1, 2, and 3 in this case are Azure services behind the scenes. So those are all reserved, as well as the very last IP address, .255, as the broadcast. And so that's why with a /24, we have 251 available addresses. Now for a subnet of this size, probably not a big deal. But if we were trying to map out and plan a lot of VPN connections, site-to-site connections, and typically we might use something like a /28, or maybe even a /29 on premises, we'll notice that now we only have 3 available addresses. You know, while the entire network might be 0.0 to 0.7 in this case, we still have those 5 addresses that are reserved for the behind the scenes things. You know, we still have 0.0 as the network identifier. .7 in this case is the broadcast. We still have 1, 2, and 3 reserved for internal services. So only .4, .5, and .6 in this case are usable. Those are the 3 usable addresses. So when you're planning out like site-to-site VPNs or certain networks that have to be maybe very specific sizes for what you're going to deploy, those 5 addresses can certainly come into play. I'm going to change this back to a /24 here. The other options as we're creating a subnet, if we do need a NAT gateway, maybe if we're going to be having a bunch of virtual machines that do have outbound traffic to the internet, and we want to make sure that we have a certain public IP address for all of the outbound internet traffic, we could then NAT all of these internal addresses to that public IP addresses. And service endpoints we'll talk about in a later video. So we'll add this subnet to our virtual network. That gets added over here. We'll go over to the security tab, hit next. So we get a few security options when we're creating a virtual network. Move my camera back down. So first is, do we need a bastion host? This is mainly if we're using virtual machines, if we need either a remote desktop, port 3389, or SSH, port 22 access to any of the virtual machines that are going to exist within this virtual network. Depending on what you're doing, that may or may not be required. It's certainly better than opening up those ports through a firewall or through a network security group, both of which we'll talk about later. But if we need a bastion host, we could deploy that at the same time. DDoS protection standard. So there's 2 versions of DDoS protection. There's basic and standard. Everyone gets basic. It's not really shown here displayed, but you have to think that Microsoft is going to protect their services from DDoS attacks. You kind of get that by proxy, so everyone gets like a basic level of protection. Standard protection, though, gives you the ability to get some insights. If you did have an attack directly on your network, you'd be able to see maybe the source IP addresses, where that traffic was coming from, specific IP addresses of yours that might be attacking, or port numbers, things like that, as well as some additional fine-tuning, like adaptive fine-tuning on the network. So this is helpful if you do have like a large-scale critical application that's internet-facing that you should probably enable. And then the ability to simultaneously deploy a firewall. So the virtual network is kind of one security boundary. We're going to maybe place virtual machines in this virtual network, have private links to other PaaS services, and linked through this virtual network. Do we need something that's going to do layer 7 packet inspection between either the subnets, between the internet and the virtual machines, between the virtual machines and maybe a PaaS SQL database? If so, we would probably need a firewall. Now, we could use the Azure firewall. That's what this is going to deploy here. You could use a third-party firewall from Fortinet, from Palo Alto, F5, any of the big network virtual appliance vendors. You could deploy their firewall on another subnet. For simplicity here, we'll disable these, keep them disabled, and go next over to tagging. Tagging is not independent or just for virtual networks. This is just a key value pair that you can create to tag and kind of categorize the resources that you create internally in your environment. So maybe one is going to be, like cost center. If you've got a specific cost center that you're trying to bill all of the resources back to, and then whatever the code of the cost center is. So just a key value pair that you can create. It would get tagged to the resource, and then you could run reports on the tags later. If we're looking for all of the resources that are billed back to this cost center, okay, great. Now we can identify that and maybe cross-charge things internally. And then for creating a virtual network, that's pretty much it. So we'll go to review and create. The Azure portal will do some validation to make sure what we're deploying meets any of the policies that we have in place, make sure that this user account has the appropriate permissions to do this. So validation passed. If any of those things would have failed, maybe we didn't have permissions in that region, there was a policy blocking us from deploying in that region, it would come back and tell us this at this point. But everything looks good, so we'll click create. Give that a second to create. Should take just a minute or so. There we go, deployment complete. So now we can go to the resource. We'll see that our address space is what we configured, that 10.2.0.0 with a /16. We can go to subnets here in the menu. This is the one subnet that we created, 251 available addresses because it was a /24. Here we can certainly add more subnets. Again, it'll bring up this menu on the right-hand side where we can add, say, subnet 2. Notice that it automatically kind of selects the next available range for us. So we had a /24 here. It gave us another /24 and automatically populated it with the next available address range. Same options for NAT gateway and service endpoints. Again, we'll talk about those a little bit later. Here's where we can then select a network security group. So this is different than a firewall, where a firewall is doing layer 7 packet inspection. Network security groups only really do like layer 3, layer 4 packet filtering. So if we just need to block based on port number, source destination, if you're familiar with like Cisco or Juniper devices, this would be like an access control list that you could put on the individual subnet. While we're just talking about addresses and subnets, we'll leave these blank for now. Click Save. And just like that, now we have another subnet. So subnet 0, subnet 1, .0, .1 in terms of addressing. And now if we were to go deploy a virtual machine, or say two virtual machines, one on subnet 0 and one on subnet 1, they would be able to talk to each other at this point. We don't have any network security groups. We don't have any other firewalls or anything deployed. So the security boundary in an Azure Virtual Network is the virtual network, not the subnets. This is maybe a change in mindset from VLANs on premises. If you're familiar with configuring VLANs, normally in an on-prem environment, one VLAN cannot talk to another VLAN. If you just kind of do this same setup, you'd have to have a router and routing rules. Where in Azure, remember, we've got those behind-the-scenes services that are already created. So there's already a router behind the scenes in 0.1. There's already a router behind the scenes here at 1.1. So if we go and deploy a virtual machine here on subnet 0, virtual machine number 1, we go and deploy a virtual machine in subnet 1, virtual machine number 2. Both of those VMs would be able to communicate any port, any protocol. It's essentially a flat network, even though they're in different address ranges here. So that's maybe something a little bit different in Azure versus what you might be used to on-prem. So we could continue to add subnets here as long as it does map back to that address space that we configured. So we can go to address spaces. Here's the 10.2 network /16 network that we identified. We can absolutely come back and add more address spaces later. If we wanted in additional to that, we could do another address space that was completely different. So 172.16.0.0 with a /16. The key here is that we most likely should be using private addresses, RFC 1918 address spaces. So that's the 10 network, the 172.16 through 32 network, and your typical 192.168 network. So that's kind of the basics of getting started with creating a virtual network and subnets in Azure. This is, again, the baseline that we would need for any type of virtual machine. A virtual machine is going to have to be able to communicate, and to do that, it has to be associated with a virtual network. If we're going to be using PaaS services with private IP addresses, meaning we're going to go deploy an Azure SQL database, an Azure Key Vault, storage accounts, and instead of using the public interface that's on the internet, we want to be able to use a private IP address to connect to those services. Same idea, they have to be associated with a subnet that's on a virtual network. So virtual networks are critically important, not only to provide that communication, but then kind of the baseline network security as we get into firewalls and network security groups. Hopefully that was a good starter for you. Thanks for watching. I hope you were able to take something away from this video. I create these on Twitch every week, every Friday afternoon. If you have any questions that you would like to come ask live and in person, feel free to come follow me on Twitch as well. Thanks for watching.